Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support the channel on Local, Subscribe Star, and buy me a coffee. Today is episode 145 of the Roundtable, the Monroe Doctrine. I'm once again joined by Keith, Florina, and Alek. Glad to have you guys all back. So the idea for this was the first show of this year for me was covering Venezuela. And of course, a lot happened that day we covered it. So that sort of was a big spike in our viewership. And then we interviewed Jose Nunez on Venezuela as well. So I thought, well, it would be a good idea to cover the Monroe Doctrine, which has come up again in the discourse, as a framing device for U.S. policy in the region and how it's a part of the conversation now, and then use that as an analytical tool to look at what Trump might be doing or might be thinking of doing in the future. So we could broadly divide the era of the Monroe Doctrine into three periods: 1824 to 1898, the original period, 1898, say 2025, and then the present with Trump's new version or reframing of the old version, whatever you want to call it. So let's begin with each era. The original grand strategic purpose of it, from the point of view of the United States, was to prevent European-style empires from reasserting themselves in the New World. So as a brief background, after the United States won its independence from Great Britain in 1783, almost all of Latin America, which at that time was a part of the Spanish Empire, beginning in 1810 and culminating in 1825, fought a series of wars for independence against Spain during the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars. And when all of these nations were essentially independent, there was a fear that either Spain or maybe France might try to reassert control over these regions. And that was the grand strategic fear of the United States. And they were like, well, we are going to have a doctrine or policy that, we wouldn't allow for that. Now, early on in the history of the Monroe Doctrine, it was really Great Britain that tacitly enforced it because it suited Great Britain's purpose. The United States wasn't going to kick them out of Canada. And they could also use it as an excuse to keep the French and the Spanish from reasserting control in the New World, something which they had wanted for many years. Now, by 1865, the United States was able to enforce the doctrine on its own, with the administration of Andrew Johnson threatening military intervention in Mexico on the side of President Juarez, which at that time was being occupied by France. Seward appealed to the Monroe Doctrine in communiques with the French. So here we have the classic use of the Monroe Doctrine for its intended purpose. The French were restoring a monarchy and an empire on America's southern border. During the Civil War, of course, the United States was unable to intervene in this regard. But as soon as they could, they did. Prior to 1898, the only conflict the U.S. had with a Latin power was Mexico. And it wasn't over Caribbean territories, but over the modern U.S. Southwest. Venezuelan diplomat Carlos Rangel did not see this as a precedent for later uses of the Monroe Doctrine for regime change and intervention, nor did the rest of Latin America at the time. This shows us that the principles of the doctrine did not originally include regime change. Attempts to read this back are, in my estimation, anachronistic. Attempts to claim the U.S. was not yet strong enough to use force and throw its weight around in this fashion are refuted by the landing at Veracruz in 1847 by Winfield Scott. The U.S. already had the capabilities for maritime action in the region and yet chose not to use them. Original Cuban annexation schemes in the 1850s came from the sectional interests in the South, which were for the time being checked. This shows that Northern policymakers did not see this as an excuse to interfere in the region. Now, from 1898 to 2025, the period that most people are going to be familiar with, is the pivot in the meaning and usage of the doctrine. The pivot in U.S. policy to use the Monroe Doctrine as a carte blanche to unilaterally intervene in Latin American nations was the result of a profound shift in U.S. policy that occurred in the 20-year period known as the Great Rapprochement between the U.S. and Great Britain. The banking elites that Andrew Jackson had shattered used the decades between 1837 and 1898 to reform and take over the nation in secret. The shadow government is the oligarchy. Under the guise of liberating Cuba from Spain, the U.S. entered the conflict for the purposes of serving business interests. This was more fully expounded on by Smedley Butler in War is a Racket. One major corporate benefactor was the United Fruit Company. Beginning in the early 20th century, the United States began to engage in more direct and unilateral fashion in these regions, such as Haiti, Honduras, Guatemala, so on. The justification for regime change being restoring democracy and ending dictatorships, and then after 1945, stopping the threat of communism. But behind it all rested the commercial interests that controlled the U.S. And then presently, what Trump has styled the Monroe Doctrine is the America first, so U.S. will use unilateral action to achieve goals in the region. It will combat immigration, secure resources, and keep foreign influence out. Treaties are deals, not partnerships. What do I get out of it? Power, maintain protectionist policies, and use U.S. soft power to compel regional nations to comply. And then military power, use force to protect U.S. interests, even if that means direct interventions. So before I pass this on, what I need to illustrate here and emphasize is that the textbook use of the Monroe Doctrine as it was meant to be used was the U.S. threat of force against France to compel Napoleon III to leave Mexico, preserving Mexican territorial integrity and independence, which is completely opposite of the current usage that Donald Trump is using, where you can then say, we're going to intervene directly in a nation to change the government. Regime change was what France was doing. The United States said, no, we're not going to allow you to do that, and we're going to use the Monroe Doctrine. So you can, of course, use the already existing political architecture to do whatever policies you want, in a sense. But what I would argue is that that is not what the intended use of the doctrine was. Keith Preston.
Yeah, well, I guess I would have to agree with the article that was actually written by our friend Jose Nino, who was on the last program, where he was talking about the relevance of the Monroe Doctrine to today's world. And the crucial distinction between the original Monroe Doctrine and anything going on today is that back in those days, the United States was just a regional power in the Western Hemisphere. That was still during the era of the westward expansion, and where we had weak nations in the rest of the hemisphere. But that was before the United States became the global hegemon that it became in the post-war period, and certainly in the post-Cold War period, where we became Pax Americana. So there's a world of difference when you're trying to compare the foreign policy of a fledgling republic on one hand and a hegemonic world power on the other hand. And the Monroe Doctrine makes sense from the point of view of a country that's simply trying to protect its sphere of influence, where you don't want hostile powers to set up military bases and puppet states in a way that threatens your own national security. That's one of the issues now that the Russians have with Ukraine. They think that NATO is trying to set up a puppet state in Ukraine that threatens their security. Whether you agree with that or not is a separate question, but that's how the Russians see that particular conflict. And the United States has historically had a similar view of the Western Hemisphere. That's why the Cuban Missile Crisis was such a big deal, because that was viewed as a Russian puppet state, putting actual missiles in 90 miles off the shores of the United States, aimed at the United States. So that's a serious security issue. Now, the problem, though, is that certainly since the end of the Cold War, and I would argue even before that, the United States has claimed the right to intervene virtually anywhere in the world for virtually any reason. If you look at U.S. military interventions throughout the world since, say, 1945, you see that there's no continent that the United States has not either directly intervened militarily or funded and organized a proxy war with local forces, either puppet governments or client states or non-state actors that were organized or funded or encouraged by the United States. We see the United States has organized military coups in many different countries. The United States has moved aggressively to influence the outcome of elections in a wide range of countries, everywhere from Europe to Australia to Latin America. So when you have the United States trying to be the modern Roman Empire or the modern British Empire, the idea that there's somehow a legitimate sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere that nobody else is allowed to be involved in, while the hegemonic power claims the right to intervene anywhere else is a little bit, of a non sequitur. It doesn't really make any sense. Now, of course, you can always fall back on the might is right doctrine, and you can simply say, we are a hegemonic world power because we can be, and we'll intervene anywhere we want because we can, and nobody better ever F with us, or we'll throw these little countries up against the wall or whatever. That's like I've heard Stephen Miller and some people in the current administration talking like that lately. And on one hand, that's kind of how the world works. I would agree. But on the other hand, there's this concept that in military and in intelligence circles is called blowback. And when you pursue that kind of foreign policy, what happens is you start getting blowback from all of these different interventions that you've engaged in. One example is the conflict between the United States and Iran. After World War II, George Kennan, the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, came up with a policy of containment, meaning that the way to contain Soviet expansionism was through a controlled containment policy, a very Machiavellian realist approach to statecraft. And it could be argued from the benefit of hindsight that Kennan was basically correct. But a problem with what happened with Kennan's policies is that the wider American ruling class got control of them and essentially used containment as a smokescreen for reinventing the old British Empire with an American face on it and absorbing the other European colonial empires in the process. And then that in turn led to all of these disastrous military expeditions. For example, the most obvious one was the Vietnam War. Another one was in Iran, where there was an effort in the early 50s to get control of Iran's petroleum resources, and there was a coup organized by the American intelligence services. There's actually a book by one of the founding members of the CIA, Miles Copeland, where he talks about this. And then that has led to the 75, 80-year conflict between the United States and Iran that we've seen going on since then. So this kind of super imperialist foreign policies tend to have the impact of blowback. 9/11 was another example. That was a direct consequence of the persistent involvement in all of the regional conflicts in West Asia and Central Southern Asia. So I think that's something that proponents of arch imperialism never take into account or just don't care about, one of the two. And asserting the Monroe Doctrine in that context is a bit sketchy. The idea that the Monroe Doctrine has any kind of legitimacy in that kind of foreign policy framework, I think, is a bit of a reach. Now, we could also argue, well, what's happening now is that the world is shifting away from unipolarity to multipolarity, to we're going back to an era like the 19th century with different spheres of influence. And I think that is the way the world is going. And in fact, I have a thing that I posted on Facebook titled, "Has the USA been fired as the CEO of globalism and imperialism incorporated?" And I think a case can be made that that's what's happened, that the world has had enough of American leadership and the USA has been put out as the CEO. And now we're going to a more regionalized management structure for, the world order. But if the goal is to create a system of security for the United States in the Western Hemisphere during the process of transition to multipolarity, then the way that Trump has been going about it is the worst possible way. If you want to have a strong hemispheric alliance against possible penetration by other major powers in Eurasia, then you don't want to turn on all of your co-hemispheric nations in the way that Trump has been doing. You don't want to tell the Greenlanders, well, we're going to annex you, or you don't want to tell the Venezuelans, well, we're going to decide who your president is going to be. You don't want to threaten the Panamanians with reclaiming the Panama Canal. You don't want to threaten Latin American countries with regime change and invasion and sanctions and blockades and all kinds of stuff like that. Because what you're doing then is you're going back to a situation like the post-war period when there was an agglomeration of countries in the United States, all of which had governments, in Latin America, all of which had either governments like Cuba or movements like a lot of other places that were overtly hostile to the United States. Instead, you want to try to cultivate positive, cooperative relationships with other countries in the Western Hemisphere. A lot of the neoliberals, neocons, liberal internationalists, they lament the decline of the partnership between the United States and Europe. But if we're going back to a system of regional hegemons, then we need to be working on building something like a United States-European relationship with the rest of the Western Hemisphere, where it's more like a cooperative partnership, even if the United States is the dominant power. And that the current administration is not doing that. If I were a foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump, I would say you're doing everything wrong. Right? You need to completely reverse course because you're digging from the point of view of national interest, you're digging yourself a hole in the sand.
Yeah, sounds like you're talking about JFK's Alliance for Progress. But Alek, your thoughts?
Excuse me. So, as far as the Monroe Doctrine is concerned, I'm going to have to frame it a little differently. See, in the news, we keep on hearing the question of direct imperialism, meaning that the United States government kidnapped Nicolas Maduro. What's next? Are they going to try to do that in Greenland? Possibly. Or, as a matter of fact, will there be an invasion? I'm thinking that the Monroe Doctrine applies in the context of soft power, the concept of cultural imperialism. That is what I have seen, having lived in Latin America for quite a while. What I'm seeing is that the United States, not so much even the government, but let us say the large-scale corporations and the tech oligarchy have been applying the concept of cultural imperialism, and they have been making it pretty clear that the United States is the dominant force with more cultural capital. And I, in my experience, I've seen that all over Latin America in the sense that, for example, many woke ideas are proliferating all over Latin America, and there has been a pink tide. For example, in Chile, up until recently, there was President Gabriel Boric, who was quite woke. Argentina has been left-leaning for quite a while. And of course, there is a movement of fat acceptance. And of course, Latin America has been pushing back in that. Now we were seeing a very interesting phenomenon that Donald Trump supports apparently market-oriented candidates in Latin America, such as Javier Milei, for example, such as Jose Antonio Cast in Chile. And that is also an example of American cultural imperialism. You see, Donald Trump did not appoint them by force. It's not that a military coup was financed somewhere, as was the case 50 years ago. What actually happened is that, these leaders are democratically elected, but of course they have cultural support of the United States. And Latin American people in all these countries who support right-leaning candidates will, of course, have ample access to North American propaganda that is in favor of right-leaning leaders. So that, to me, is an example of the United States exercising its cultural capital. So beyond that, however, it needs to be mentioned that it has become increasingly unlikely that the United States will continue to exercise hard power in any other meaningful way. The Venezuela case was a fluke. This is a one-off. We're not going to be seeing much of that. The days of military coups or regime changes are already numbered in Latin America. We're not going to be seeing that in Cuba. Though what we may be seeing, however, is that one way or another, the Cubans have access to the internet, although the government tries to restrict it and to control it. And the United States government and the tech companies will try to influence Cubans in a way that makes them more sympathetic to the Trumpist point of view. If not that, well, they'll always try the woke angle. It depends on who's in power. So, if anything, there's a bigger concern that the Cuban regime, or even the regime of Colombia of Gustavo Petro, will be undermined by social media, by American ideas. It has been said that allegedly the Russian government meddled in the election, or so the Democrats say, that they helped Trump get elected through troll farms and social media use. Be that as it may, Yevgeny Prigozhin had his own company called the Internet Research Company, which was an internet trolling company that specialized in propaganda. Well, while that may be the case, there's certainly much more of that going on the American side now. And the target audience is not Russia, it is Latin America, and it seems to be working quite well. It seems to me that Latin America is getting Americanized. And one example of this is actually fat acceptance, as I mentioned before. That this is a phenomenon that did not exist 5 years ago, and I can attest to that personally when I had first moved to Mexico. Now we're seeing a rise in obesity and a rise in a feminist attitude about obesity. We're seeing a rise of Latin American feminism, which has nothing to do with, say, the tradition of Susan B. Nightingale, or any kind of, or Susan B. Anthony, excuse me, and Florence Nightingale, or any kind of second wave feminism. Nothing to do with equality, and it really is about crass, bland, and brash in your face feminism, which is distinctly American, and that is an example of cultural imperialism that stems from the United States. Now, that, I believe, is the new angle of the Monroe Doctrine, which certainly a sharp deviation from the model that existed 50 years ago when military coups were financed.
Okay, Florian.
Yeah, thank you. Good points. I think the central element that changed among the Monroe Doctrine is that it has been like once the U.S. became a hegemonial power, the U.S. has basically cloaked the Monroe Doctrine in a liberalist, institutional, moralist narrative, right? And so it's basically, yeah, we are the good guys, we are the world police, and so on and so forth. It was very moral and very pro international institutions, and now Trump is coming and changing it into more of a transactional policy, like okay, pay me and we'll do a deal, right? So one reason, and what Keith alluded to that, the Russians don't trust NATO because NATO and the US have been cloaking their imperialist attitudes, if you want, in a moralist international institution language, and that's one reason why the Russians don't trust NATO. And Trump is getting a better connection with Putin, I think, because he just says this is all transactional now, right? So you can basically negotiate better with someone who is willing to be honest about their goals, right? That's also the reason why Europeans are still irritated, because they believe in international institutions, and I don't know the English words. German word is Völkerrecht, international power, and international law. And people from the Trump administration in the US are saying that, you know, if you don't have the power to back it up, there's no international law, right? Because there's nobody to enforce it, right? So in a way, you can say that norms are not there to construct international boundaries. Norms follow a differential of power, of geopolitical power, right? So and this is basically what the entire new version of the Monroe Doctrine is underlying, right? So so the new things is from Europe stay out is now everyone stay out, and Trump targets China, Russia, and any third party gaining strategic leverage in the hemisphere, right? So, and from moral language, it became explicit bargaining, right? Under Trump, our Latin American states are treated as sovereign actors, not proteges, but the sovereignty comes with price tags and consequences, right? So, for example, you want Chinese infrastructure money, okay, but then you have reduced access to the US. You want US security guarantees, then we get a line on trade, migration, or anything else, military bases, and neutrality is only tolerated if it's strategically irrelevant, right? So then second, so the first part was from Europe stay out, is like everyone stay out, and then the moral language changed, and we now go into explicit bargaining. And the third difference is that Trump looks at strategic choke points, right? The Panama Canal, Caribbean ports, Mexican migration and fentanyl flows or drug flows out of South America, Greenland for future shipping lanes and security, and also like rare earth minerals. So this is what now has become. And the reason why this is possible now is we have a multipolar reality. You know, we're not pretending we're the sole moral superpower. And also, people in the US are exhausted with interventionism, right? They don't want nation building. They don't want moral crusades. They do want borders, right? And Trump frames this all in a very open way. And it correlates with the mood, if you will, with the vibe of the American right. But it shocks, of course, diplomats around the world, which are used to an international rules-based order. But as I said, rules and norms, they follow power differentials. And that's something that many Europeans aren't yet grasping, because also Europe thinks that I think Europe also overestimates its power in the world. And so they think Europe is basically doing all these international negotiations with wine and cheese in France, and Trump just is like a CEO that negotiates with an Asian counterpart. Like, here are the facts, boom, he puts them on the table, and then, you know, do whatever you will with it. We are going to do this, you're going to do that, right? So to go more to answer a little bit more specific points that were brought up, Keith mentioned that if you pursue a might makes right policy, you will get blowback, right? So I think, though, that's true, but I think, though, that Trump may talk big, but then is much more pragmatic and realist. So people call that taco. Trump always chickens out. But I think that's just a bit of a misunderstanding of Trump's vein of realpolitik. He talks big, but this is also to change viewpoints. It's not so much as carrying a big stick, like talk softly and carry a big stick. That was Teddy Roosevelt in the beginning of the 20th century. Now people say, I think Ramsey Paul had a video where he said, carry a small stick and talk big. But I think Trump doesn't always, sometimes has a blustering rhetoric, but he also sometimes just wants to change the point, wants to just persuade the other side to declare to which point they will be going and what they are willing to put into the negotiations. I think it's a much more persuasive way of talking rather than a direct threat that is then backed up by the military or something like that. So I feel a little bit more differentiated. And Trump's empty threats aren't smart, which Keith mentioned. I agree with that. But as I said, maybe Trump is just an extremely rough negotiator, and what he says is not really what he wants in the end, right? So maybe he just wants to put everyone in a better negotiating position. And he's certainly willing to walk away from the negotiation table. And for example, the tariffs, right? The tariffs look like a big smokescreen, but the scare of the tariff was enough to bring other countries to the negotiation table and maybe break up like long-term encrusted structures that had formed, right? So basically, Europe may have been like a high school clique that has been there for decades, and Trump just like takes his fist rhetorically, like smashes it right there, and then he forces Europe to realign, and maybe that's one of his tactics. So maybe he doesn't even want to use a stick; he just wants to break up old structures, right? Alexei mentioned that the Monroe Doctrine applies in the context of soft power, and that's certainly true, right? cultural imperialism. At least that was the case until 2016, and now is Trump bringing a transactional element into the fold. He's not interested in cultural dominance anymore. I don't think he is. It's all transactional. It's all deal making, and maybe like remember that Iranian general that they just killed him. They just assassinated him, and that was that, right? With a very targeted strike. And also, nation building isn't really necessary anymore if you can send in your Delta team and just kidnap Maduro or any other president, right? So you don't need to have like your ground forces move in when you can just do decapitating airstrikes and targeted actions like with the Iranian general and Maduro. And there's probably much more going behind the scene that we don't know. I may have forgotten some things as well. So the U.S. exercising hard power in regime change days, they may be over, but maybe, as I said, you don't need like hardcore regime change if you can just take the choke point away in a way, right? So I think that's what changed with the Monroe Doctrine. It's much more, Trump uses it in a much more transactional sense, in a very pragmatic way. In a way, you could say that we could square it with the rhetoric also coming from an administration that maybe the vibe, if you will, of the current administration is a newfound manifest destiny, but moderated by realpolitik. Maybe that's a good description of what the U.S. is doing right now.
All right. Just before we move on, Alek mentioned to me privately, to all of us privately, that he's feeling under the weather. He may not be able to come back. So for anybody watching, that's where Alek went. So there's a few things to go with here. I think the Monroe Doctrine, Trump's pivot to act this way, is a sign of weakness. It means that the United States is not able to exert its former control over the world. And I think a lot of this bluff and bluster and action in Venezuela, as I mentioned almost 2 months ago, was in order to deflect from that, right? The U.S. lost in Vietnam. They go to, Panama. The U.S. loses in Afghanistan, and now they go to Venezuela. There's a lot of that going on. Now, as far as I wouldn't question or argue against Alek's point that soft power is being used. That kind of fits into Ralph Peters' 1997 article, Constant Conflict, where American pop culture is used against Islamists and the Soviets. But the thing that I would push back on is I don't think regime change is off the table, nor the military use of force. Because one of the things is we've got the Cuban Miami Rubio mafia that wants revenge for the communists. So Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are all potential targets. And I've seen videos such as the Caspian Report and others talk about this. And I think that there's something to be considered here. Now, to what extent will they do like a Bay of Pigs style thing or Panama Enduring Freedom kind of thing? I don't know. But it does seem that there are at least elements within the administration that would not be opposed to such use of force. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily off the table. The other thing is this sort of like more. So at least in the Cold War, right? It was still transactional. It was still these business interests behind the scenes. But the fig leaf was we're stopping communism, right? Trump doesn't really see. It's all gone, right? All of that is gone. It's just how does this benefit the U.S.? Now, on the one hand, even if that's been the case for the last 100+ years, you don't say that, okay? You don't say that to the whole world. You don't say that in public. That's why you have the term. They said the quiet part out loud, which you don't do, right? And I would argue this is a sign of weakness that he is saying the quiet part out loud, because even in the beginning, of this hard pivot that I point to at 1898, the rhetoric was we're gonna fight for Cuban independence, right? Even though it was for United Fruit Company, right? They didn't say that. They said it was for Cuban independence, and so they were still wise enough, or at least clever enough, to not just say that. I would argue this is where maybe Marx comes in, right? Marx says that capital will eventually just unmask itself. And this could be that unmasking process where it's like, well, yeah, we don't care anymore. We're just doing this for the bottom line. And what's interesting here is, as Keith said in his opening statement, that, Trump is doing everything wrong from a hemispheric hegemonic position. I think, Kennedy, even though on paper his Alliance for Progress failed to meet its objectives, arguably because it was too idealistic, and I'm not sure Kennedy fully appreciated all the other, realpolitik economic interests involved. It does indicate, though, that there is a different way you could do this. And I think what makes the original Monroe Doctrine and its application vastly different than Trump's is, well, I would hesitate to say that the Andrew Johnson administration was being altruistic. I mean, after all, a French empire on the southern border is not in the U.S. interest. But he didn't go to Juarez and say, hey, you know what? We're not going to help you out unless you give us all these energy concessions and you do what we say for the next 50 years. Because it's only we're only going to do it if it benefits us in this, narrowly defined economic way. The original application was like, well, no, it wasn't quite that self-serving. I mean, that's not the deal that was made with Juarez in order to get the French, in order to collaborate to get the French out. And so one thing that the classic application and interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine could be done is it could reframe, if done properly, all of the mistakes that have been made since 1898, and especially, recently in recent years. Because I think what happens is people are just using these terms, and the modern terminology would be the strategic architecture, right? That's a lot of talk about EU and NATO. Well, what the Monroe Doctrine in its original interpretation could do is provide a security architecture framework for the New World that is not the sort of obviously transactional Trumpist doctrine or the more covert transactional doctrine of what we saw during the Cold War. And so that's something to consider as well. But now, as far as what might be, if they continue the idea of regime change, the Miami Mafia that I talked about, I don't think they pick anybody else other than Venezuela, because, again, the party that Maduro represents is still in power. There wasn't a regime change. That's just rhetoric from Trump's part to look like he did something when he really didn't do anything. And so if there is going to be further escalation, I would still expect to see it with Venezuela, though, of course, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Cuba are smaller countries, so it might be easier to justify there. That also is contingent upon how much of the political capital of the president is tied up with ICE and the whole, immigration issue. It could very well be that domestic concerns are going to take up Trump's political capital for the foreseeable future, in which case large-scale interventions in the Caribbean might be moot after all. Keith.
Well, I think that a lot of this has to be viewed within the context of how the world has evolved in the last 30 years or so. Back in the late 90s, in the pre-9/11 era, we had the emergence of what some people on the right have called the New World Order, or we had a system of globalization that was unipolar, where you essentially had the United States as the world hegemon. And within that context, we saw through neoliberalism and globalization, we saw the integration of the world's trade and financial systems. And then we saw the rise of American cultural imperialism of the type that Alexei was talking about. And we have to remember that both the neocon wing of the American foreign policy establishment, like the George W. Bush people, and the liberal internationalists, the Democrats, all of those were very big on soft power, on cultural influence. And the Trump administration has been aggressive about trying to undermine that. That's what Doge was in part about. And that's why a lot of the liberal internationalists and neocons got so upset when U.S. aid was dismantled, because that was a core tool of the exercise of soft power by the United States. And if we look at that, if we look at these direct attacks on these instruments of soft power with attacks on NATO and attacks on other countries in the Western Hemisphere, the picture that emerges is one where there seems to be an effort going on to weaken and isolate the United States. I mean, if you wanted to come up with a strategy for weakening and isolating the United States so that the United States can no longer be the de facto CEO of world capitalism or whatever, then how would you do it? Well, you would undermine military alliances like NATO. You would undermine or create conflict with otherwise friendly countries in the Western Hemisphere. You would undermine the ability to exercise soft power by undermining the agencies that are used for that purpose. All of these, you would engage in tariff mania, and in a way that's potentially damaging to the U.S. economy. So it appears to me that what's happening is that the forces of international capitalism have pretty much decided that they're done with the United States as the CEO. It's like when a corporation forces out the CEO. They're like, no, we don't like the CEO. This CEO is getting a little too reckless, or doesn't know his place or whatever. So the board of directors moves to push out the CEO. That seems to be what's happening to the United States. If we look at the kinds of interests, for example, that are behind the Trump administration at the top level, if we look at the coterie of billionaires that accompanied Trump on his trip to Saudi Arabia last year, we see the CEOs of major finance companies like BlackRock, major tech companies. Right? These entities are not interested in a new Cold War with Russia and China and places like that. They want to do business in these places. Right? They want to have a globalized economic system where they can do business. Right? In fact, that's why a lot of hardline Western communists have now become Trump friendly or Trump sympathetic for this reason. They think this is going to have the effect of facilitating détente between East and West. And if you look at how the Russians and the Chinese reacted to the recent national security strategy document that the administration put out, they more or less approve of it. The Russians said, yeah, this is kind of what we want as well. And the Chinese have more or less said, well, yeah, this is kind of accelerating the decline of U.S. dominance, and that's kind of what they want as well. So it appears that the Western capitalist elite, the BlackRock types, the tech oligarchs, all of this other stuff, and the parallel elites in the Eastern world, it looks like all of these collectively are essentially firing the United States as the CEO of world capitalism. And Trump is the tool through which that's being done. I think a lot of these elites view Trump as somebody that all they have to do is whisper in his ear and tell him to do something stupid and he'll do it. And then it'll be sold as some aggressive, nationalistic, make America great again policy. But in reality, it's having the effect of undermining the United States as a world power, to the point of offending and alienating even the closest allies. For example, European countries. Right now, even a lot of the political right in Europe, for example, that has been somewhat Trump friendly, even a lot of those forces are saying, well, wait a minute, we don't know about all this Greenland stuff and all of that. So that's what's happening. I mean, the United States is essentially pissing off the entire world in terms of former friends and allies and all of that, and creating a policy framework that's implicitly friendly to the interest of the Eastern powers. And the reason for that is not that Trump is a Russian puppet. It's because these entities like BlackRock and stuff like that, they see East-West financial integration as being critical to the kinds of business development interests that they want to pursue. They want to do business in the global South with the BRICS countries in the Eastern Hemisphere. They don't want to sanction everybody and stuff like that. That gets in the way of business. They're trying to set up a world like the 19th century where nation states might have their own spheres of influence. For the United States, it's the Western Hemisphere. For Russia, it's this Eastern Europe, Central Asia. For China, it's East Asia. Right? But there's still going to be financial unipolarity. The integration of the East-West financial systems through the Bank of Settlements, through BlackRock, through all of these other things like that, the City of London, Wall Street, all of that is still going to be the financial hegemon worldwide. And that's how entities like BlackRock and like the tech oligarchs, that's how they want it to be. Now, one thing that's interesting is because there is an alliance in the United States between these new elites of world capitalism and this more traditional Sun Belt, national industrial bourgeoisie, is the Marxists would call it, but it's the Midwestern and Southern and Western industry whose traditional rivals are the Northeastern finance capital establishment. So the new elites have aligned themselves with the Sun Belt. But the thing is, the Sun Belt is now assuming something of a junior partner role. And I think that the consolation prize they're going to get is basically a return to, 19th century style American nationalism, like William McKinley or Teddy Roosevelt, where it's like, hey, yeah, America's going to be dismantled as a world empire. But the consolation prize for the Sun Belt is you're going to still get to be, imperialist in the Western Hemisphere and all of that. We'll still dominate the Western Hemisphere. That seems to be the part of the foreign policy paradigm that's shaping up. And I think that that's really where things are going now. When publications like The Atlantic and think tanks like the Atlantic Council and Brookings Institute and all of the Council on Foreign Relations, when all of those people lament and say, yeah, Trump is destroying American soft power, he's destroying our alliances, he's destroying the rules-based international order. Yeah, he is. He's doing all of that. But the question is why? It's not to make America great again as some sort of Reagan-esque type of American pride thing. It's about weakening and isolating the United States as part of this transition to multipolarity.
Okay, Florian.
Yeah, good point. I also think that, as Keith talked about the DOGE cuts, I think we also have to keep in mind that, if you cut government bureaucracies, then there's always the danger that you're cutting into your own, into the parts that are important for yourself, right? Arguably, Trump has less. I mean, the left had a lot of institutional power, and by getting rid of a big part of the institutions, that institutional power is not available for Trump either anymore, right? It's not like, okay, we want to eliminate 30% bloat, and there's like 30% of bureaucrats that only do bloat, right? That's not how it works. It's more like every bureaucrat does 70% good stuff and 30% unnecessary stuff. So if you kick out some of these bureaucrats, then you're also hampering the necessary stuff, right? And the second thing is what DOGE actually did was they looked at the Office of Personnel Management, Department of Education, Centers for Medicare, Department of Commerce, NOAA, which is the National Oceanic Agency. I think that they are doing the weather stuff. Defense Department, Department of Veterans Affairs, Inter-American Foundation, that such agencies existed, and USAID. USAID was an independent apparatus that arguably also funneled a lot of money for regime change. Now, interestingly, like they haven't all been abolished. Like they have been, like to a large part, they have been put under the authority of the State Department again. Like USAID is not independent anymore. USAID is no longer a standalone federal agency by July 1st, 2025. And all the foreign assistance responsibilities were consolidated within the State Department, right? So they're on a more direct control of Rubio or whoever is Secretary of State at the moment, right? There are other examples like Office of Foreign Assistance that was reorganized, right? And you can bet they kept the ones that they wanted to keep, right? Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, Labor. I think they renamed it Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Religious Freedom. International Narcotics Law Enforcement, that moved under the Undersecretary for Arms Control in International Security and stuff like that. So if we want to know what the U.S. is up to in the future and how they understand its role in the world, it may be a good idea to just look at exactly which agencies were kept up or just reorganized and how is State Department structured now? What is now under direct control of State Department top management, right? What is under direct control of Rubio and his undersecretaries? I think if you look at that, then and maybe look at how these agencies have been used in maybe the Maduro kidnapping and other actions, then we might know where the State Department really wants to go. But it's really important, I think, to keep in mind that those didn't cut everything. I think those was actually stopped before it could go too far. And I think like Department of Defense, they don't want an independent agency like those rummaging in their trunk, right? Because there's a lot of bloat as well, and they don't want those defense contractors. They don't want their role eliminated, right? So those cuts were good. I'm in favor of them, but a large part of them were also a little bit for show. And the core agencies, they exist. Like USAID is just not independent anymore. It's now under direct control of the state. That's good if you agree with the goals of the State Department. It may not be that good if you don't agree with their goals, because now they have direct control, right? Now you can't influence USAID independently anymore, right? So there are long-term effects that we shouldn't underestimate, and that may work actually against the Trump administration if another administration, the Democrat administration, gets power. If someone like Vance wins the presidency in 2028, then probably everything will go on as it was now. But there could be some problems down the line if maybe even already if the midterms go to the Democrats.
All right, we'll move into the final statements now. I'm just going to say that Trump's repositioning on the Monroe Doctrine again is, as I said when we covered Venezuela almost 2 months ago, is a sign of weakness. The U.S. has lost the GWAT. It's been losing in Ukraine. And this is an attempt to look strong. But I think overall, though, as Keith pointed out with the idea of blowback, this isn't the strength that they think it is. Final thoughts, Keith?
Well, as far as the Monroe Doctrine, I don't really see that having much of a traditional application in today's world. As I said earlier, I think we are going to see increased conflict in the Western Hemisphere between the United States and other countries in Latin America. Because, as I said previously, while America is receding as a global hegemon, I think the consolation prize is going to be trying to exercise greater dominance over the Western Hemisphere, and that's going to lead to increased conflict with various other countries. Todd mentioned earlier that, for example, that Marco Rubio is basically the de facto acting president for foreign policy, and he represents the Florida Cubans, the Florida Venezuelans, the Florida Nicaraguans who still want revenge for the revolutions that happened in those countries that dispossessed their former ruling classes. And I think that will probably be a core component of U.S. foreign policy, at least as far as the Republicans are concerned, when they're in office. Now, with the Democrats, I think they're probably going to be more concerned about trying to rebuild the old system and doing damage control for the things that they think Trump has messed up. Now, whether they'll be successful at that or not is a different question. I tend to think not. I tend to think that the unipolar moment has passed and that we are moving into a multipolar world, and that American power has receded, essentially for good, or at least for the foreseeable future. So that's where we are now. We're moving into a very 19th century-like world of major power rivalries, regional spheres of influence, international financial hegemony, and then also class conflict. We're seeing a growth of class conflict in different societies around the world. So it's a very 1900 era model of political economy and statecraft.
Okay, you get the last word, Florian.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree with Keith. There's probably more conflicts afoot. Although I would say maybe since Trump right now, the U.S. right now are able to basically do a targeted strike and basically keep the whole situation in South America under control, it's possible that these conflicts will still take a while to break out. They will be more subdued. And also, given the rightward shift of South American countries, maybe we'll have a dynamic where left-wing uprisings will basically be subdued within South America itself, right? There's also a very small chance, but there's still a chance that American expatriates, especially the ones that are especially the ones that would belong to the ruling class, or the richer people, millionaires, billionaires, may actually leave the U.S. if like California wealth tax proposals become more concrete in the next decade or so, and then you'll have basically basically U.S. power will be carried personally into South American countries, which are already, like El Salvador, for example, or Argentina and others, Chile, which are also like right-wing conservative friendly. So the U.S. may actually expand its power over South America more than it has ever done because of political realignments. But yeah, I agree. There may be some more conflicts afoot, especially if the U.S. can't use Delta teams or special forces, or decides not to use them anymore for whatever reasons. It's gonna be an interesting future.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Florian. We all hope Alek gets better soon. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.